All right, so today I wanted to talk about a topic that I have really strong pedagogical feelings on, and that is not looking at your hands while you're playing. Um, I end up seeing a lot of arguments from people that it doesn't really matter, but I would say that these are pretty short sighted overall. They usually come from people who rely on brute force memorization, and to them, it's basically unimaginable that you would be able to play a piece at a high level without having it memorized. And at that point, why wouldn't you just look at your hands? And I usually analogize this to reading in your native language. For people who, most people can read pretty well in their native language, and if I gave them the option of reciting a chapter from a book with the book in front of them versus memorizing it, most of them would choose to do it with it in front of them because it is an enormous extra cognitive load and an extra step to try to memorize paragraphs and paragraphs of text. But that's essentially what the people arguing for the what else would you look at, the people who rely on pure memorization with music, they're doing the same things to themselves, but it's only because their music reading isn't good. And I think you would probably assume that of somebody who would prefer to memorize text is that their reading in real time isn't good of their native language. So yeah, what else would you look at? You could look at sheet music. You could look at a lead sheet. You could look at a lyric sheet because might need to be reading lyrics. You might need to be reading lyrics and chords at the same time. You might need to be following a conductor. You might be accompanying a soloist, and you just need to be able to look at them to gauge tempos and other things like that. You might just be improvising, and you want to have a casual conversation with somebody because that's something that happens to me where somebody wanders up and they start wanting to talk to me while I'm playing, and I'm just improvising, and they think that's the coolest thing. I'm just doing like 4-chord improv, and it's really easy, but to them it's magical. But those are a ton of reasons to why it's useful. And granted, most of those are a little more in the professional sphere, but it's really useful to anybody else because it can really help how confident you are with your playing, and it can, like I said, reduce the cognitive load, and you can learn more music more quickly if both your reading and proprioception skills are much stronger. So I think most people would find that they are drastically more confident in executing things that they can play without looking at their hands. I definitely found this to be the case with me when I started working on not looking at my hands. And I actually think this has a lot more to do with the process. I don't think the mechanism is the not looking at your hands, but I think it's the sort of practice process you have to employ to get to the point where you can play something accurately without looking at your hands. When you're not looking, it forces you to play slower. It forces you to pay attention to all the little details and little inefficiencies and actually be consciously aware of what your hands are doing. And that sort of attention to detail and really actually being mentally engaged with your practice, I think is really the big reason that you end up being a better, more consistent player when you practice not looking at your hands. Now, there was a time when I was not good at this at all, and my practice approach for a difficult section, which will sound familiar to way too many people, is I would get however many bars, 2 bars, whatever, and I would basically memorize it very quickly, and then I would just repeat it as close to tempo as possible 100 times or whatever. But really what I'm doing there is I'm going into autopilot. I'm not totally engaged with what I'm doing. I'm not thinking about what my hands are doing. Since I'm not slowing down, I might not notice little inefficiencies. I don't really have to think about any of the distances. I'm just kind of tuned out during that practice. It's not very deliberate practice. And so in the end, I would find that a lot of times something I'd practiced a lot was not executed cleanly when I had to perform it. I find that that's less the case now. Things that I don't have to look at my hands for, I'm usually much more confident and I execute them much more consistently in performance. So while I think that you probably could reap a lot of those same benefits by practicing slowly and looking at your hands, why not kill 2 birds with 1 stone and try to work towards minimizing how much you look. Develop your proprioception as much as possible along the way. Even if you do decide to memorize your music or you're just improvising freely, things where you can look at your hands, I think that most people would find that they have a lot more freedom in their playing when they don't have to look at their hands. Okay, so first of all, we're going to go through a series of steps to working on this, specifically targeted at technical exercises. And step one is going to be look at your hands. Absolutely watch your hands while you're playing. That seems counterintuitive, but there's a reason. You do not want to build in lots of bad habits and inaccurate procedural memory just because you're hunting and pecking blindly. You want to be as accurate as possible. You need to make sure that you've already cleared the hurdles of just the basic technical problems, and that you know what your hands are doing, you know where they're going. Make sure that you can execute all of that first before you even try to do anything else. This actually kind of goes along with one of the big problems that's going to separate absolute beginners from more experienced players. Beginners just can't do this. An absolute beginner can't practice sight reading, really. They can't practice really that much not looking at their hands right out of the gate. I mean, very early on, they should start working on those things. But if you're a rote beginner, you don't have that technical foundation to fall back on. You don't know what anything feels like. You don't know what this distance feels like. You just simple things that most people will take for granted. That this scale is hard for you. Playing it without looking is hard. Playing it while looking is hard. That cross is hard. Oh my God, playing your hands together and lining up all these fingers, that's hard. So be aware that those are things you're going to have to work through, but look at your hands and make sure you're playing accurately, because if you're trying to go, scales 4 octaves, hands together, up and down at some crazy tempo and not looking at your hands, that's all too much. You shouldn't do most of those things anyway, but definitely not without looking at your hands. Okay, so step 2 would be to close your eyes while you play. What you're trying to do here is visualize what your hands are doing. And the trick, I would say, is to not move your head. So keep looking at your hands. You'll be looking but not seeing your hands. So basically, I could play this C major scale, and I just saw my hands do it. I know what it looks like. Now I'm going to look again and close my eyes. You can still kind of see what's going on there. You just saw your hands do that. So I think on one part of that is that it helps you to visualize what you were just doing because you watched it. I think the second important thing is that it's a weird aside, but in the past I found that sometimes I would develop a weird tick of some sort while practicing on a difficult passage. Without realizing it, I did something weird with my tongue or whatever, like weird stuff with an eyebrow. And when I was playing it later, I would realize, oh God, I do that every time I play that passage. I can't undo this weird eyebrow twitch or tongue movement when I'm playing that passage. And basically what I've done is I had sort of chained together the procedural memory of me executing the passage and doing that weird thing with my mouth or whatever. And those things just go together. Now you can eventually disconnect those and that, it may or may not be worth doing. But in this case, that's kind of what I'm trying to avoid. Don't move your head up because you've attached yourself already to this position. And as small as it seems, just tilting your head up, eyes closed or open, suddenly that introduces like an extra thing and you feel disconnected from where you're at. A little bit of your proprioception and spatial awareness is tied to all of your body. Everything's connected. So it can be a little disorienting. So look, but don't see. Keep your eyes there and open as needed. Now that's the other thing, open as needed. If you find that you're starting to be inaccurate, open your eyes and you can just slowly work through a process of opening and closing as you need to, maybe squinting a little bit, maybe one eye, whatever you need to do to slowly wean yourself to the point that you're very accurate and very confident playing while looking and not seeing with your eyes closed. Okay, so now step 3 is somewhat obviously probably to raise your head and open your eyes and be able to keep playing. And I would say to do it in that order. You're starting here, but raise your head up, but keep your eyes closed and do this. And then see if you can do it with your eyes open. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting in my practice is that often I'll actually find it easier to practice on a new piece of material, especially things that are involved with like improv and chords and and just slightly new technical things that aren't super technically difficult, I'll find it easier to practice them with my eyes closed. And I think a big part of that is that basically I'm removing all of the input from my eyes, and that lets me focus in a little bit more. So I think that when you're trying to get to the point where you're opening your eyes, you want to already be confident just having your head up with your eyes closed. You know you can play it pretty well, and then slowly open your eyes, because that's kind of there's just that little bit of visual distraction. It doesn't seem like it's a lot, but little things, just that little bit of extra that your brain has to process when you're still on that cusp where it's difficult. That little bit of edge might give you just enough to focus in and make sure that you can execute these things. Now, if I was going to add kind of a little addendum here to step 3, it would be to have the sheet music of whatever you're working on technically. If there is sheet music, a lot of times good technical exercises aren't written down. You've just made them up. But if you have sheet music, if you have scales in front of you, okay, now look at your scale book and follow along. You want to create an association between what you're playing and what you're reading. And now this is actually your eyes somewhat actively engaging while you're playing. That's that next level of difficulty. Now that you've looked up, you've introduced just general visual noise, and now you're looking at something that you're actively processing. You're not, because at this point you've memorized it. It's a scale. It's technical, simple stuff, whatever. But look at it anyway. It doesn't matter that you already know it. Look at it, because that will help with that association. And it's at least a little bit of you working towards kind of reading while you're playing. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about how to specifically use some strategies for sheet music and not just technical work. Some of these, if you're a beginner, they're going to be maybe a little out of your scope, but try to incorporate them. But ultimately, you need to develop a certain amount of technical proficiency broadly before you get too deep into some of this stuff. But I will address a few more beginner issues in a little bit. But let's look at this. First strategy is basically try to read through whatever you're going to read as slowly as you have to. And rhythm is not important. Pitch is. Intervals are. The vertical alignment of your music, making sure everything lines up, that's important. I know some people will disagree with the rhythm thing. The thing is, it's right now it complicates things. You should isolate your rhythm practice to where your rhythm is just no longer an issue. I actually still have my book right here. Get this book. If you have any rhythm issues, get this book. Work on your rhythm in isolation. You work on both hands in this book. It's fantastic. You just tap on your lap, you're good to go. But what we're trying to do here is just worry about pitches. So worry about pitches and intervals and shapes and things like that, and make sure you give yourself the time to develop whatever you need here. So let's just take this hymn, for example, to kind of tell you kind of the process that I might think through if I was going to read this. So I find where my hands are going to start. Okay, so I see one of the notes moves. I play the same note in the right hand, but in the left hand, the lowest note goes from an F down to an E. So how far is that distance? Okay, and what finger do I want to use for that? Okay, it's here, and then play it. Okay, and then I walk this up. Okay, so the left hand thumb is still on the same note, and I go down again, and then my right hand, okay, I'm already on this D here, and I need to add this F, so okay, that's good. Oh no, what do I do now? Okay, in my left hand, I just put my third finger down because it's already hovering over the F, but what about my right hand? Okay, I need to kind of squirrel some fingers away. Can I get my 5 ready for that F and my thumb ready for the A? Yeah, that's crazy. It's ridiculous how slow that is. That is the process. If it takes you that long in the beginning, that is fine, but that's the process. You just get really fast at it over time. So don't fret that it's crazy slow. Be ready to do that. Think through, where are my hands now? Where do they need to go? Okay, which fingers need to go there? Move them, and now play. That kind of thing. Just keep doing that until it's basically instantaneous. It's frustrating, but it'll get you there. I would also say don't play hard music. Play as easy music as you can. You should still be able to read at a reasonable pace for the music you're working on. Normally, I would say for music that people are going to practice for performance and progression, I would say if you cannot sight read it at half the marked tempo most of the way through, it's above you. For sight reading, fine, go slower, go 25% of the tempo, whatever it takes. But also don't work on music that is so difficult that there are too many demands on you technically to execute it. If you're having technical execution problems, go work on technique. Fix those problems. If you're having trouble with thirds, right here I have trouble with thirds sometimes. Work on your thirds as an isolation exercise. Don't get in the mire with the piece you're working on. So work on easy music. Okay, so let's talk about the second strategy. These aren't really in an order at all. These are just strategies you will apply as you self-assess where you're at. In a way, this is almost like a step back from the first one that I mentioned. If you're having trouble with that, one of the things you can do is think about using your peripheral vision. And that's not looking, it's not focusing, but, maybe you're playing and you just take a second, you keep looking at the page, but you draw your attention to your hands and where you can see them out of the corner of your eye. Whatever you need to do to just be aware of where they are, but without actually looking down. So try to not look down, but let yourself be aware of where they're at. It's a little thing, but that can help bridge that gap to getting you better at being able to execute without looking really at all. All right, so the third strategy is that if you're going to look just with your eyes. So basically, if I was playing along, I can glance down just with my eyes, and I don't have to move my head. I can catch my hands and then snap my eyes back to the page, and that's kind of the point, is it makes it a lot easier to get your eyes back in place. If you move your head, there's so much more motion, and now you've introduced multiple planes, and so you've got to move your head and then your eyes, and they're trailing. It's milliseconds, but that actually matters if you're trying to read along at tempo, or maybe you're trying to sing something and the lyrics are small and you lose your place, which can be really easy if you've got lots of stacked lyrics and maybe, a chord sheet or something. So keep your eyes where you're at as much as possible. You don't want to lose your place. Surely people notice this with reading. You lose your place a lot. I'd also say if you're wearing glasses, that head motion has to be pretty extreme for a lot of people to get their lens lined up through their eye to see where they're going. So that's a lot of extra motion. Now, granted, I'm just wearing reading glasses, so I'm not blind under them like the way my wife is. She can't see very well at all without her glasses. But even if that's the case, if you're going to do the quick eye glance, it's still basically going to be enhanced peripheral vision, I think, is the way that it would work. You don't have to really look all the way down. You'll get a lot of information because mostly what you need is just the vague shape of black keys and white. Okay, so speaking of black and white keys, use the topography of the keyboard to your advantage. We most of us understand that we've got these groupings of 2s and 3s, and we know how they feel. If I'm sitting on an E flat, I can feel this F sharp and this G sharp, this E flat chord. I can feel these on either side. If I make a big jump, which I'll get to more in a second, I can feel that. I'm going for the C, but I can feel this C sharp right here. There's a lot of that stuff. Even if it's really simple, you're just looking at like doing something like this, and you're a beginner and you're having trouble with, these kind of low cadence things. Maybe you need to reach down and be like, okay, am I between here? Can I feel this key? Okay, I'm in the right place. And while that's not the way you actually play, like your technique would not involve you reaching and grabbing things, taking the time to check is pretty good. You'll eventually get to where you don't have to use that little check. I especially find that with large leaps is that I'll rely on little brushing and catching corners a little when I'm making big blind leaps. And I used to do that a lot. And now I just don't most of the time. I don't need to as much, and it just kind of fades away without you even noticing that it's faded away. But definitely be aware of the topography of your keyboard, and if you're working on something, know what it's going to look like in your hands without looking at your hands, and just kind of feel it out. If I need to move from this C chord up to a D chord, I can feel that F sharp, million examples. So just make sure you're feeling your keyboard. Okay, so as I was about to edit the previously recorded footage, I realized that there was an important strategy that I had not covered. It's one of those things that I don't even think about at this point most of the time when I'm playing, but it's basically using a position you're already in as a guidepost or an anchor to connect to another position. So let's just say I'm chilling on this open fifth, and the next thing I need to play is this octave. Now I can't reach the whole thing in one hand, so you can't just practice feeling these distances. So I know where this pinky is, so I move my thumb to where that pinky is, and now I can span that octave. At first you might actually need to physically do that and like do this awkward thing where you're kind of like tucking your thumb, and this can work for any kind of fingers. You know, if I was sitting on this seventh, I could do the same thing, drag this thumb over to here, and now I've got this, or whatever, just any position that requires you to stretch well beyond your normal hand reach. But you might start by actually moving your finger to that position while maintaining a finger on that position. But over time, you get to where you don't really need to do that, and you're just aware of where it was in the spatial relationships within your own hand. And vaguely related to that, while I'm on the topic, don't be unaware of how far apart your hands are from each other. This is something where I've actually realized that without thinking about it, a lot of times if my hands are close together, I can feel this third. So if I'm chilling on this octave and I have this up here, this first inversion triad on the C chord, I can feel this third right here between my hands. I actually know how far apart my thumbs are. So be aware of that. Sometimes you do need to make movements that would put you somewhere in the range of your other hand, and knowing where your hand's at, you really can. Like, that is the sense of proprioception within your body, knowing where your parts of your body are in relationship to each other. So from there, I guess I'll jump into whatever I was going to edit after this, and my shirt will change again. All right, so now let's actually talk about large leaps. I would basically say to approach them with the same 3 steps that you approached any technical exercise with that I mentioned earlier. But there's a couple of extra steps, I think, because they can be a little complicated. So one of the big ones, I think, is to decrease the interval between you looking and getting your bearings and then closing your eyes. So let's say I'm doing this stride pattern. That's a pretty big jump. You can't even see my hand all the way down there. So what I would do is I would look, I'd play this, and I'd look, I'd get my hand there, and I'd close my eyes right before I hit that. And maybe I'd look here, and I'd close my eyes right before I hit it. And then basically try to decrease that. So maybe I'm closing my eyes not right before I hit it, but right as I hit it. And then right before I hit it. And then you just work your way up to where, okay, I'm going to do it while my hand is mid-flight, right? And then maybe you do it where you look at your destination and you close your eyes before you even leave the first spot without looking too long at the second spot. So you don't even get the travel time for that, and you just keep minimizing how much time your eyes are open. And that'll kind of get you there. And then, you can eventually work up to step 2 and 3 where you fully close your eyes and then eventually get your head up. But I would also say don't forget about step that fourth strategy about topography. This is where this becomes really important. And I already kind of mentioned it, like be aware of that topography. So I'm going to make one less octave jump so you can see it, but I could jump down here. And it's like, oh, that's not quite right. I didn't make it. You aim for that distance and you feel around and you're like, no, that's not it. And then you can move down. So if I find I'm between these keys, I move down. Okay, there's my C. And, you might jump down and land on the C and you're like, oh, there's this space. Now you'll know you don't actually have to go as far as the B flat to know that there's not a black key right here. So it's like, okay, I'm on the C. Being aware of your of the topography for that is great. And like I said, like that's something I end up doing a lot is I'll brush across things, or I'll do this thing like, say if I was jumping down to like an F, I more or less am pretty close to where that's at, and so I might draw down off of these F sharps down into that F, and that's just a little training wheels, a little crutch, and it eventually wears off, and you don't need it anymore. And for me, it's one of those things where it drifted away, and I didn't even catch that it was, oh, I no longer need that crutch. It just started happening that I didn't need to feel those out or think about them. So definitely think about adding some extra steps and being extra conscious if you're working on big leaps. Okay, so now let's go back to addressing some issues that beginners might have because they might not have been able to work through all of those strategies because they don't have the technical skills yet. One thing you can do, and actually anybody can do this thing, is go back to music that you've already learned to play. So you learn to play it, it doesn't even matter. So it was some time ago, and you've already moved on several pieces. Well, go back to a piece that you learned in the past, and now play it again and try to learn it without looking. You'll definitely have to slow down. You'll have to work on it, but try to get it to where you are looking at the page. Once again, this is going to help reinforce that association between what you're playing and what the notes are on the page. That'll make you a better reader a little bit through osmosis. But the thing is, you know how it feels. You've played it correctly before. You should have a little bit of confidence in yourself that you know how to execute it. So now it's just an issue of, okay, make yourself be able to execute it while looking at the page. And just work through that. And I would also say maybe apply that going forward as a stretch goal to any future pieces that you learn. Learn them, make sure they're technically sound and that you're not struggling, but then maybe after they're good and they're at tempo, slow them down a lot and force yourself to play them off the page. Over time, you'll just get to where that just becomes part of the process. And if you can make that part of the process, especially anybody who's already kind of more advanced or intermediate or whatever those words mean, they can already do this. They should be working as much of that into the process as they can along the way. All right, so I'd like to add in a big warning here, and that is to not let your efforts towards learning to play better without looking at your hands hinder your overall development. Technically or on pieces or whatever. We're all going to find spots where we can play it pretty well. Maybe if you can play it okay without looking at your hands, and then you find the only thing that's stopping you from moving forward technically is the fact that you need to look at your hands, and you could play it 10 or 20 beats a minute faster if you looked at your hands. Do it. Absolutely look at your hands. Don't let this be the one bottleneck for you. This will take a long time to develop. Just like sight reading, this is a skill that takes time to develop. So make sure you look. But what I would say is that when you come back to look at that section the next time that you're going to practice in a practice session, start it well below tempo and try to practice it then without looking and work up until you need to look. In general, that's the way that I would recommend practicing, period. I always practice within very broad tempo ranges. I always end up starting a practice session 20 or 40 beats a minute slower than whatever I played it at the end of my previous practice session. It lets you focus in on a lot of details, and this is one of those details, not looking at your hands. If you slow it down, you can practice specifically not looking at your hands until you really need to continue progressing. And a metronome really can, not only is it good to practice with a metronome, but it's a thing that'll help you objectively know that you're making progress, especially with this. Because if we were doing that thing where if you were only auto-regulating your tempo at the beginning of each practice session, you'll tend to always play at a tempo that is maybe just on the cusp of what's possible for you. So what that means is that it feels the same level of hard. And if you don't have something to objectively measure that, you don't realize that you made progress. Because, for instance, I could be playing my scales at 60, a totally random number, and then the next day I'm playing them at 70, but I wasn't playing them with the metronome either time. They feel the same level of hard, and I don't realize I got any faster. So I just feel frustrated because I didn't make progress. But if I had been using the metronome, I'd realize, oh my God, like the 60 was a bitch yesterday, and today it's kind of reasonable, and 70 is only kind of hard. Wow, I made a lot of progress. So using a metronome really helps you feel objective progress. Um, but I would just say overall, take a very balanced approach to working on playing without looking, because it's not going to happen overnight, and you should not hamper your overall technical development. Because one of the big things about that is that learning pieces, learning more technique overall, um, having that while looking at your hands is going to carry over, because all that procedural memory that you built in by playing it well and accurately is going to make it easier to play it without looking. So don't tie both arms behind your back in that respect. Okay, and so the flip side of that warning is that you should work on it and not neglect it. And if you're watching at this point, you're probably not going to neglect it, or hopefully you haven't already, because the saddest thing that I see is people who have. They've neglected it for 10 years, 15 years, and they can play at a very high level, very technical pieces, but they've never not memorized and never not used their eyes the entire time they were playing, to be watching their hands. That's the entire process for them. So going back to fix it at that point, I think a lot of times for them is just, it's embarrassing and it's frustrating, because they have to go back and work on very, very simple music to slowly build that up. And usually by the time you're able to play very advanced stuff, you might not have the patience to fix the problem, or you might start making the arguments why it's not important to fix. I see a lot of arguments, the big arguments I see against not looking at your hands or against sight reading, sometimes I suspect that they come from people who don't want to admit that they've created a problem for themselves that would require a lot of embarrassing remediation to fix. So work on it along the way as much as you can. It's really nice when, at some point, if you're doing it really early on, then the stuff that is at your level, that's at a really appropriate level for you practically, is also at a level that you can play without very much looking, so that nothing ever gets behind. So your reading is caught up, your proprioception is caught up, and your technical ability is all caught up. And the only times, that maybe they don't keep pace is if you're working on a really, really, really difficult piece of challenging music. But for most music, you should be at a level where you're progressing very smoothly and fluently. And it's great because you can consume so much music with good reading and proprioception skills. And that just means more variety, more volume, more styles. And that's just more opportunities for you to learn, because you're just a sponge. You're soaking up so much music. When you're only working on a handful of very difficult pieces over months and months, you kind of miss as many opportunities for your brain to learn. So if you do find yourself in a case where you are much more advanced, but you're not quite good at this yet, yeah, the reality is you will have to play easier music and you will have to slow down a lot. But over time, you'll find that more and more of the music at your level doesn't require you to look. And it's very freeing. So I would highly encourage people to get on track working towards that. And since I have my book right here from a previous video, I will say to anybody who's a beginner, especially working towards sight reading, or anybody who doesn't have, anybody who's more advanced, who feels very not good about their sight reading, get this book, Progressive Sight Reading Exercises for Piano by Hannah Smith. It's really easy. It's offensively easy, but that's fine. I always say prove it. Like, you think it's too easy, prove it and put your hands on the keys. If you can't just blaze that book, there are bigger problems. So the nice thing about that is, if you are a more advanced player, you should be able to very confidently play that. Like I've mentioned before, it's all in a 5-finger position, so you don't have to think too much about where your hands are. The positions, and it really gets you comfortable not having to look at your hands, because there's almost no reason to look at your hands. You can get very good at comfortably reading ahead and reading very simple rhythms and things like that. So that should be the starting place for almost anybody. Anyway, I hope this was helpful to somebody.